It's a great pleasure to be back. I always have a sense of homecoming and an eerie sense of familiarity to be in these ballrooms. So thank you all for coming. I have spoken at Princeton a couple of times about my somewhat strange journey into this world of religion and development, but I suspect that there are a number of you who have not heard the tale, so that I will start with a little bit of a story of how I got where I am and what I'm doing. I saw this as an opportunity, in a sense, to take stock of where this field or this topic is and where it's going. So I wanted to reflect on some of the questions that arise and some of the issues. I also thought I would focus on two areas that are the subject of a lot of attention now. One of them is the sort of security, religion, poverty link. Some call it shared security, human security, various dimensions of that. And secondly, a new and substantial effort to bring religious organizations into some of the major global health battles. And then finally, if there's time, and I wasn't quite sure how long I was supposed to talk, about half an hour or something like that, and because I would like to spend at least half the time we have on questions, I sometimes do a sort of inbox exercise, sort of what has been on my plate, or what are the topics that are emerging, not necessarily from my own interest, but from outside sources. So first of all, I was a development person at the Woodrow Wilson School, though actually at the time there was a strange name for what I was, which was Woodrow Wilson School Gentlemen, which was the people who were not really economists and who were in the development field. We were the first group of women here, so that was part of the history. But anyway, I was in development and started doing work particularly on urban affairs for various reasons. I had been interested in the big cities, particularly in Africa, and did some consulting on that, and really came almost by accident to the World Bank. Started working as an intern, a consultant, and then in the United States Executive Director's Office, and eventually, because I was a specialist in urban issues, which was a new field at the time, ended up working on agriculture. In the classic logic of these institutions. So I then spent a long time, more than half of my life, more than half of the World Bank's life, working on what were basically very operational issues. So I was, first of all, a task manager, then a division chief for a large agriculture division struggling with the problems of agriculture in Africa through the 70s and 80s, sometimes a heartbreaking task. Then moved onto the countryside and was a country manager and a country director, Latin America, mostly then on Africa, and then worked for a while on East Asia, particularly during the East Asia crisis. At this point, Jim Wolfenson, who was the president of the World Bank, asked me to help him temporarily with an initiative that he had started with the Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, to try to deal with what had become very substantial tensions between religious organizations and the World Bank. There were tensions around debt, tensions around structural adjustment, tensions around pretty much everything. But as Jim's vision was that this made no sense because the sort of general world of religion and the world of development had the same objectives. They were the champions of the poor. They wanted to see social justice. And so he wanted to get them together. He also had a vision which is not dissimilar from Rick Warren's, which is that he, as a business leader, saw religions as the largest distribution system in the world, that were present in every village, every community. I've tried sometimes to make general estimates of how many people they employ, but it is enormous, absolutely enormous. And it had been completely with very tiny exceptions, off the radar screen of institutions like the World Bank. Also, most of the United Nations system, most of the bilateral agencies, with, again, some exceptions. So in any event, they had started to get together before I got involved with a variety of religious leaders from the 9 major world faiths. They had interesting, complicated meetings, realized that there were huge problems of communication. But in any event, they decided that what they needed to do was to set up an organization called the World Faiths Development Dialogue, and that's where I was brought in to try to be part of a task force working with Bain and Company, which Jim Wolfenson had persuaded to do a pro bono exercise. So we generally met for a period of several months. The leaders, who included the Aga Khan, someone from the Vatican, the head of the Bronfman Foundation, George Carey, and someone else. So they all decided that they would start this new organization. At which point, all hell broke loose. Jim, at one point, briefed the board of the World Bank saying that he was planning to do this, and his comment frequently is that it was 24-0 against him, 24 being the number of executive directors who represent the 185 countries. There was tremendous unease, and I think from this process, because we spent about 3 or 4 months actually talking to each one of these representatives, we have a unique insight into why you're not supposed to talk about religion at the dinner table, why the State Department has had such difficulty in formulating a concrete and persuasive approach to religion. And essentially, to put it in a very, very brief nutshell, it amounts to 3 Ds and an E as the sources of objection. The first is that religion was seen as divisive. Religions fight each other. Religions are the source of conflict. Religion is in tension with the state. The French, of course, with laïcité, were very clear that they voted against any activity that would involve working with the world of religion. But a general sense that the motivations of religious organizations were seen as related to proselytizing, to a different agenda that was, ironically, highly political. So the politics of religion was something that caused a great deal of nervousness among these representatives who came mostly from ministries of finance. So divisive. The second was quite a strong sense that religion was basically dangerous, that religion opposed modernization, and there was no issue that had as much significance as reproductive health rights, reproductive health, and the roles of women. What was interesting, talking to people who were important leaders in their fields, Claire Short, Mark Malloch Brown, and others, was that their impressions formed through the battles around abortion, contraception, condoms, HIV/AIDS, had spilled over into many other areas. And when they saw religion, they saw condoms. When they saw religion, they saw the kinds of tensions and opposition around these issues. And that it had distorted the picture of what religious organizations were about to a point that religions were seen literally as being patriarchal and opposing modernization. The third was an assumption that religion was basically pretty much defunct, that as societies modernized, religion became less important, and therefore the operational implication for all of you who know about policy was that this was not a priority, or even that it belonged to other organizations. UNESCO, for example, could deal with these kinds of issues, but that for the World Bank, it was not important. A final issue, which is really a personal observation that I had, was I was part of the early discussions about gender issues in development. And those early days were difficult. They were difficult because very few people would come to meetings. People were skeptical. But in addition, when people came to meetings, their voice tone changed. It was very clear that gender issues involved a very personal, very emotional approach to issues. So it was very difficult to have a serious discussion of the role of gender in development, particularly in those early days. And it was only when you started to have data and information and a persuasive case that even people like Larry Summers were essentially converted to take a very strong position that there is no better investment than education of girls. I found the same kind of phenomenon around religion. And what it meant was that almost everyone who approached the subject approached it initially with, what do I believe? What do I think of religion? What does religion mean to me? Not an objective, that's interesting, I hadn't thought of that before, how does it fit into the paradigms, or why is it that we have not invited these people? Why is it that we've not considered this? It has been a long and very difficult path. I've been on the path, just to summarize, for about 10 years. Initially, Jim Wolfenson was determined to advance this work, and the organization, the World Faiths Development Dialogue, was set up in the UK. However, the World Bank itself played a much less active role than had been intended, and therefore the organization has had a rough ride. Interestingly, in the meantime, various things happened, including 9/11, which really prompted a major rethinking of the role of religion, not necessarily from the same perspectives that we were approaching. It was more the Muslim world, questions of Islam, links to terrorism, moderates versus extremists, etc. But in any event, after 2001, clearly religion came onto the agenda. But you had some important developments. You had Madeleine Albright with her book, The Mighty and the Almighty. You had Bill Clinton, who gave a major speech. And what was interesting was their message, which was that had they been more aware of these issues, they would have taken a different approach. They would have seen things, asked people's advice that they had not otherwise. And then Tony Blair, when he retired as Prime Minister, took up this cudgel and created another foundation, and a philanthropist called Ed Scott, who had been trying to persuade a major Washington think tank that works on development, the Center for Global Development, to focus on religion for years, unsuccessfully, started his own organization, the Center for Interfaith Action on Global Poverty. So there are new organizations in this area, but there still is the same kind of hesitation and lack of clarity as to what it's really about. And clearly there's some good reasons for that, and there are some less good reasons. In the process of the World Bank agonizing over what it would do with the Faith Initiative, I decided that it made more sense to be outside the bank, and so I've moved to Georgetown University, rediscovering the academy after a very long hiatus, and also focusing on the World Faiths Development Dialogue, with rebuilding an organization. And in fact, Ruth and Chris spent their summer working for and with the World Faiths Development Dialogue and know it intimately. So a brief stock taking. First of all, what is the question? Okay, you talk about religion and development. What's the question? The World Faiths Development Dialogue, as well as me personally, approach the question from the perspective of development, not from the perspective of religion. Our concern is poverty. Our concern is injustice in the world. And our concern is that development institutions can do a much better job, that development assistance is rarely ideal, and that we have, over the years, learned a great deal. In fact, it's quite interesting if you ask some of the veterans of the development process, people who've worked on development from the 50s or 60s. I'm not quite the 50s, but the 60s. One of the central conclusions, a theme you hear all the time, is it's complicated. In other words, back here, when I was in one of these ballrooms and listening to Sir Arthur Lewis and to some of the other people in the mid-60s, late 60s, there was really an understanding that development was fairly straightforward, fairly linear, that there were some pretty clear recipes. You won't find very many people who will take that kind of view today. Pretty much everything that could go wrong has gone wrong at one time or another. There is a much wider appreciation that this is truly a multidisciplinary enterprise, that there is no single path, that the combination of politics, anthropology, economics, history, narratives, etc., plays a major part, and that it's increasingly difficult to define where you're going. And as we all know, if you don't know where you're going, it's often very difficult to chart the path. In this development history, it is really quite remarkable how little the story of religion figured. It's when you set it in the context that I set out before of international relations, a field of international relations where religion was almost invisible. I think that the Kissinger book has no reference to religion. The History of the World Bank, which is 2,000 pages, has one reference to religion. You can go through indexes and you can see a remarkable dearth of attention to what was going on in the world of religion in most international relations textbooks. And so it's not surprising that the development world was similar, even though, of course, there were these organizations, Catholic Relief Services, etc., that were playing significant roles. In some senses, it was the vehemence of the critiques of the development process and the development institutions during the period of civil society mobilization that caught people's attention. The Jubilee Debt Campaign and some of the other demonstrations, peaceful and not so peaceful, demonstrations against dams and so forth. So as we started to look at the role of religion, we were astounded, I think, at the complexity of what is involved. Tens of thousands of organizations, different faiths. I discover a new faith at least once a week. And it's absolutely fascinating. And as a historian, it's world history that you see. When you go to the Parliament of the World's Religions, who's anyone here going to the Parliament, apart from Paul? I'm going to the World Parliament of Religions in December. It's living history, with everyone in costume, except that it's authentic. It's really quite stunning. I was at a World Council of Churches meeting a few years ago, and I was quite intrigued by pink bishops wearing pink, and actually peach. Mm-hmm. And I asked a Jesuit friend of mine, who are the pink bishops? Mm-hmm. He said, I haven't the foggiest idea. He said, I can't even keep the Catholics separate, distinct, much less looking at these. It turned out that they were Thomists from India, a fascinating group that has a winding history that links to Orthodoxy, Anglicanism, Catholicism, various Indian traditions, and they do have their unique dress and their unique hats and so forth. So the process of finding out what all of these groups are doing and how they approach things is a remarkable voyage of discovery. In this process, I have come to be allergic to one pet phrase that you hear, which is essentially that the world is divided into people of faith and presumably people of no faith. I think that somebody in one of our seminars made a useful comment that everyone has faith. The question is what you have faith in. Actually, one interesting comment last week that someone made was that no one has more faith than farmers because they put seeds in the ground and wait for something to happen. So I think that this idea that the world is divided into 5 or 6 billion people of faith and the rest not of faith is really a distortion. And it does lead to people saying, well, people of faith or women of faith or whatever should do X, Y, and Z. It's a much more interwoven, complicated tapestry because the question of what people believe and how their belief affects their work and how it affects their lives and their values is a story that each individual has. In fact, one of the things we're doing at the Berkley Center that we're finding immensely valuable is in-depth interviews with people. We have about 70 on the website and a number more coming, which essentially ask the question, what does religion have to do with the way you approach your work and development? And each one of these interviews offers remarkable insights. And some of the interviews are with people who say, I've never thought of that before, or who say, who say rather defensively, I don't go to church, or whatever. So I think that's a first conclusion. But there is no question, I think, that the organizations, the ideas, the people who are involved with religion have been neglected by researchers and by activists who work in the world of development. And in many respects, the religious worlds decided and wanted to stay separate for a while. In fact, there's one phenomenon that I'm beginning to understand recently. One reason why there is strong pressure for many mission hospitals and so on to come into the discussions about health sector policy is that for a long time they could finance their own work from mission proceeds and so forth, and that is no longer the case. It's partly because health costs have gone up, partly because people can't afford to pay what they need to charge, but it is also that this external world, which allowed them to be in a cocoon, in a sense, is no longer true. So what we're faced with is both a framing issue, which is does this belong on the agenda, and if so, how, and a major knowledge issue, and the two are very much linked. Because there are huge knowledge gaps in this area. First of all, there are definition issues, which again come back to this question of can you really say that a school is a faith school or a public school, because very often they're hybrids. They've changed over the course of their history. They have dual relationships. Even the Georgetown University Hospital, which was clearly a Jesuit organization to start with, is now a private corporation, which has a sort of Catholic character, so they don't give out birth control, but still it is very much a mixed enterprise, and that's true of a lot of the world. So the definition issues, but then there also is the fact that a large part of the religious institutional structure is extremely decentralized, fragmented, and people have not been used to studying it. Just to give an example of health, there are hugely varying estimates of the share of health that's provided by religious organizations in Africa. The WHO, after a study, came up with a number that went something like from 30 to 70% of health facilities are provided by religious organizations. The Catholic Church says 29.6% of AIDS care is provided by Catholic institutions. But on that one, we have no clue where that number comes from. But it's very precise, so somebody must have calculated it. But the 30 to 70% gives you an idea of a range. But then when people look at household surveys and ask, where did your health care come from, the numbers are well under 10%. So we have a huge statistical puzzle. But then there are two other hypotheses about faith state-run facilities. One is that they tend to reach the poor more effectively, and the second is that they're better quality. And the evidence for this is close to zero. I mean, we don't know the answer. And clearly, there's one part of the answer, which you can all guess, is that there's huge variation. In other words, you go from the very, very best to the very worst. And there may not be a systematic answer. In other words, it may not, this is where I come back to this, just because it's linked to faith doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or worse. But it's off the radar screen. So that, I think, is the first thing. And then it is not studied, and we don't have information. Plus, in the world of aid, where we know that the dispersion of aid efforts is a major problem, and aid harmonization is a central priority, the fact that this whole world of religious organizations and the finance, I saw Bob Wuthnow has the number that $4 billion goes from the U.S. to missions overseas. I mean, huge amounts of money are going, huge radio stations are broadcasting, and there's no systematic understanding of this within the development community or anywhere else. So I think that the knowledge issue is a very important one. And as we all know, this is a phrase from a secret memorial to Bob McNamara that took place this week. Secret because he had given strict instructions that there would be no funeral and no memorial, but there was. People were reminded again and again that his maxim that if you couldn't count it, it didn't exist. But also, he would not accept that you couldn't count it. So, in other words, the discipline of trying to get this kind of data is very important. And then, of course, we have all of the policy questions. Some of the policy questions in the U.S. are fairly easy. Is it reasonable to have public funds going to organizations which have hiring practices that exclude? What about going to organizations which only serve certain groups? Is that legitimate? And how more broadly does freedom of religion and freedom to spread the good word, how does that affect international relations in the contemporary world? So there are a whole host of policy issues, but we're really only just beginning to frame them. So let me go quickly through the two topics that I said I would mention and then open it up for questions. I think I've given you enough of the in tray in my sort of side comments. First of all, the World Conference on Religions for Peace, or Religions for Peace, I think at their Global Assembly, which was 3 years ago in Kyoto, came up with what I find a very interesting and important concept, which is shared security. Shared security in many ways grows out of the effort to reframe development as human security. And that in turn, there was a big UN task force, there are departments of human security, there are books about human security. Nobody knows exactly what it means, but everyone talks about human security. But to me, one of the important elements of it is to try to bridge the sort of hard-nosed security people, including the military, but also the diplomats, with the much softer education environment and so on, and to convey that they're very much part of the same problem, and that if you want to address international relations and international development, you have to deal with both. You have to deal with education, jobs, you have to deal with police and safety, you have to address the issues of terrorism, but you also have to deal with the causes of terrorism. Now, clearly in all this, religion is a part. Because it's part of everything. Religion can't be separated from anything. But the Religions for Peace framed it as shared security. And the point that they were making is that in today's world, no one is safe while there is fundamental insecurity elsewhere in the interconnected world. And this is part of this phenomenon of globalization, which we're all living, and its repercussions and its implications. I'll stop there, but I think that the framing of human security and shared security is a very important theme. The second development that I wanted to tell you about, which I think is much more practical, is that one of the wedges into this issue of where religion fits in the development agenda is precisely in health. And we, in the Berkley Center and World Faiths Development Dialogue, did an investigation that we found quite fascinating of malaria and religion. And it was very much supported by the sort of gurus of malaria work at the global level. Not, I don't think, with any terribly clear sense of what it was that it would involve. But, you know, Tony Blair has nets as a major theme on his website. It's what the Faith Fellows, which is one of the Tony Blair Foundation programs. It's trying to select a group of 30 young people who will do interfaith work. So we explored this question of malaria. And essentially, we focused on malaria on three major areas where the faith world intersects with the global health. The first is in advocacy. Malaria is a very attractive issue. There's no sex except the mosquitoes. But it is also a major cause of child deaths. It's a major factor for many people in the world. It's close enough in some senses to our own history that people can remember that in Louisiana, malaria was a major issue. So it is one of those issues that allows people in many different walks of life, whether it's sports leaders or Angelina Jolie or whatever, to be able to visualize and to understand and to advocate for the development enterprise. And it brings churches into that discussion. So the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Mennonites, many other groups, Islamic Relief, and others have adopted malaria because it is attractive. A second is that, as I was saying before, an unknown but important part of health facilities are actually run by religious organizations. They belong as part of the discussion. And as Chris will remember from a meeting we had in Accra, the Summer of Religion and Development Leaders, one of the lasting comments there was, if you're not at the table, you end up on the menu. And basically, it's about who's in the policy discussion, who's involved, and are these hospitals part of the discussion? Are they part of the solution? And then the third, which for malaria is really quite straightforward, is the communities. And this is where you have this extraordinarily dense network of religious organizations, which hopefully can help to distribute nets, but also assure that nets are used, help to convey the idea that malaria is not inevitable, that if you take your child to the doctor soon enough, that they will live, that indoor spraying is necessary, a whole host of other factors that can make, in a period of a year, an enormous difference in child mortality and in welfare in communities. So that's sort of the bundle, the three levels. Interestingly, we're doing now a study, and again, Chris was involved in the early stages of that this summer, on tuberculosis. And we started again with tuberculosis. You know, what does tuberculosis have to do? What does religion have to do with tuberculosis? The answer is a lot, but it's also complicated. It has a lot to do with advocacy. One of the interesting things about tuberculosis is how frightened people are of it. There's also quite an interesting parallel. You know, in the history of religion, leprosy was a major issue, and in some ways, some of that is sort of transferred today to tuberculosis. Some of the fears and even some of the sort of approaches. So tuberculosis is a huge problem, and it's growing, and so that is a major issue. It's also the question of the facilities. The role of the communities can be absolutely critical in therapy, monitoring therapy, which is which is essential of survival. And then there's a fourth set of issues, which applies more to AIDS than to malaria, which is the question of stigma and the question of attitudes. And again, addressing the religious organizations, having a dialogue, informing them about what the realities are. All of these are very important elements in successful campaigns against a disease like tuberculosis. Interestingly, what this has brought us into is a major global debate that I'm sure many of you are focusing on, which is the sort of vertical versus horizontal. I'm sure you're aware that there is a major conglomeration of funds around HIV, AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and other specific diseases, which are in some senses almost run like military campaigns. Malaria is attractive because you just buy millions of nets, and theoretically the problem is solved. What that has done has been to suck money away, or at least to stop money going to basic healthcare networks, and therefore the sort of routine health facilities. So there's a sort of war going on about the vertical versus horizontal, and how do you do what everyone knows needs to be done, which is to integrate them. And again, this brings us into the religious communities and the religious organizations who need to be very much part of that discussion. So we've come a long way. We have major issues of framing, of education, of definition of policy, but we also have enormous opportunities by reaching out, by curiosity, by understanding, by dialogue about tough issues, to make a major difference in the quality of development work. So I'll stop there, and I don't know how you want to do this, but delighted to hear it.
Would you like to field your own questions?
Sure.
I have a question about that disparity between the claims that the faiths make in terms of how much service they're delivering versus their clients, if you will, who are saying, well, I only think I'm getting it from 10%. You said there was 30 to 70% health care provided by faith organizations, but only 10% of the population thought they were going through faith organizations. Is it possible that these, for example, I'm involved with giving money to Catholic Relief Services. They tell me that they never proselytize, and in the case of Ethiopia, which is a country I'm involved in, it's largely Islamic Muslim population, and they work with Catholic communities, but they don't make service contingent on anything having to do with faith. Is it possible that that's why there's a disparity between what people, what they're getting and what they think they're going to?
I have to say it's a real puzzle, and we have a variety of hypotheses. There's actually going to be a meeting at the WHO, which is going to focus on the statistical approaches and to try to at least to have some common sense of what counts and what doesn't count. I think part of the lowest numbers are coming out of household surveys. And the household surveys were clearly not designed to answer the question of whether it's faith or not faith. Whether it's faith or not faith may not be a relevant question, but it's certainly those surveys were not designed to answer that. But they do have questions sort of like that in many of the household surveys. And it is very possible, as you're suggesting, that people don't know or don't think or don't relate to the fact that the place that they go to, even if it has a cross on the wall or is run by someone in a nun's costume, that has something to do with faith. It's just normal. So that's one hypothesis. Another more complex one is what is the definition of health facilities. There is a very interesting program that it's the University of Cape Town, but it involves a number of other universities, the Carter Center, Memphis, the big Methodist hospital in Memphis, Gary Gunderson, a lot of it's a sort of virtual collaborative effort called the African Religious Health Assets Program, which has done some very interesting work, including detailed mapping in Zambia, Lesotho, and less detailed in a few other countries. One of the things that they've done, and it's in their name, is that they talk about religious health assets. So they are looking, and you know, anyone who knows about health, we know that most health care is basically in the family. It's in the community. It's not in hospitals. So the question is, what are you defining? How are you dealing with that? And then when you add spiritual health, which some people do, it makes it even more complicated. I must say that my tendency is to say I want to know how many beds, how many nurses, how many doctors. But even that becomes quite complicated. The other part of it, but there are other things. I mean, for example, we suspect that even the numbers, which are very firm for a country like Ghana, where there are long established, there's a memorandum of understanding between the government and the Christian Health Association of Ghana and between the Muslims and so forth. Even that, we suspect, is not picking up a lot of the incredible dynamism of religion in Africa and the Pentecostal churches and some of the others, which have not traditionally been primarily involved in health and education, but which are getting into it. So even that may be outside of some of the numbers that people have been capturing so far. What we've concluded in this is that we need to do thorough, careful studies of at least 3 or 4 countries and essentially do a thorough mapping of those or even of a sample within those countries. And we have 2 Princeton in Asia fellows who are spending this year in Cambodia combing everything. They're talking to everyone that they can find, the Buddhists, Muslims, Jains, Catholics, Latter-day Saints, you name it. And it is an extraordinary. I mean, the complexity and the reach of these organizations, the diversity of what they're doing is absolutely fascinating. But I don't think that until we actually look at a country and try to say who's defining what and who's doing what, and above all, what tendencies does it show, what trends, and what do we know about quality and impact, that it's going to be very hard to do more than sort of say this is big and important and therefore you should pay attention.
Just wondering, one of the conversations that I've heard a variety of times in looking at religion and international relations is religion really a category that is useful because of how complex it is? I mean, you say you see another religion every week, and they have a variety of different ways of being predictors of actors and things like that. How do you respond to that question as how is religion as a category helpful in development, in being able to determine anything? I mean, we've seen, it's complicated as a mantra, and so and so many different religions have so many different styles of even the way they believe in, personal efficacy or to get into questions of theology and organizational structure. So I just wonder, like, in your own work, how have you, or even in convincing the World Bank that this is a useful tool, how do you answer that most basic of question of what is the definition of religion that you use to present it as a category of discovery?
It's a tough question. When you're dealing with an organization like the World Bank, you need, if you're going to make any impact, to deal with it very pragmatically. And therefore, you need to answer the question in quite utilitarian terms. Right. And that is why we tend to start with health, education, HIV/AIDS, and try to convince our colleagues that they are missing out both a large part of reality, which makes them uncomfortable, but also a large part of experience, which may be useful. In other words, that there is a huge experience out there in institutions and organizations. They are also very interested in, partly because it's the current vogue, in this density of community presence. But again, they don't quite know what to do with it because it is so diverse. But still, it's an argument that makes people wake up. The more difficult questions, and Peter Berger, who's a sort of guru of sociology of religion for any of you, has always said to me, but you're too instrumental. And I also object because he says all you're interested in is welfare, education, and health, to which I land on the table and say those are not welfare. They're the most fundamental thing that there is. But the point that what he's looking at, and what is also very interesting, is the degree to which belief affects behavior. Whether it is the propensity to risk, whether it is savings behavior, sort of puritanical savings behavior, even dietary. We're looking at agriculture right now, and it's clear that there are links between religious traditions, practices, and organization and land tenure and water use. Some of them are very, very ancient. Some of them are very much alive today. I have to think, I teach a course on religion and development, but I'm not convinced that it's a subdiscipline that should continue. To me, it is a lens, and it is a perspective that is missing. One story that I tell that goes way back is that I was in Mauritania some years ago as the country director for the World Bank, traveling to the Senegal Valley for a visit with the Minister of Agriculture, the new Minister of Agriculture, who had been a military person before. He didn't want to be with me for a variety of reasons. He thought I had messages he didn't want to hear and so forth. But we were still trying to make conversation, and I finally found a topic that he was interested in, which is we were talking about camels. And he clearly had a very large camel herd. He knew every camel in Mauritania. He knew about the trade with Libya, about meat production, about hides, what happened to the teeth, you name it. I then went on and asked him about cattle, and he knew a bit about cattle, but not that much. And then sheep and goats, he knew much less. Chickens, I sort of went through the livestock litany because I'm interested. He was the Minister of Agriculture, even though he didn't know very much about it. But then we came to a village in the valley. And I looked around me, and I saw about 25 or 30 donkeys, which were, using to transport the kids, wood, moving houses, grass, everything. And so I said to him, what about donkeys? And he answered me, on n'a pas d'âne. We don't have any donkeys. So I thought, do I have a definition issue or something? I said, well, what's that? And I pointed to the donkeys. He said, that's not important. And I guess I took from that sort of this metaphor that you can have it staring you in the face and not see it. And I think that's a large part of this religion issue, is that people simply don't see it. They don't see the Jesuit school, or even, they're sick and they go to the Adventist hospital. But they don't really register that that's an important part of the healthcare system, that if you're looking at healthcare, you ought to be looking at. They don't understand the dynamic of the religious transformation that's changing Africa and other parts of the world. So the first thing is a question of awareness and sensitivity, and I guess what that also means is listening to the voices. Now, listening to the voices is a complicated issue because there are differences in language. And there are differences in framing. And one of the tensions that we found is what I call fear of economics. So in a lot of religious leaders, they're very uneasy about dealing with economists and the whole world of sort of economic, therefore the World Bank and other organizations. So in some ways, in order to be able to hear these voices, there needs to be some kind of training or giving people the tools. We had a discussion in the management group at the World Bank a few years ago about religion in Latin America. And I briefed the management team about, Fe Alegria and the education, the number of Jesuit universities, I forget how many there are, but lots, and about the importance of the Pentecostals, a whole variety of other things. And the management group of very smart people sort of looked at me and they said, that we really had no idea. We didn't know anything about it. It sounds really interesting. It sounds important. But what do we do? I mean, what's the Catholic Bishops' Conference? What are the Dominicans? I don't understand. Who are they and who would I talk to? So in that sense, I think a part of the challenge of what we need to do is to find better bridges so that people can communicate with each other. Yes.
2 quick questions. First of all, I think you've done marvelous work. But are you optimistic or pessimistic about where this is going, number one? Second quick question, is there are isolated marvelous examples around the world that get so little publicity based on the total negative publicity? First of all, your opinion, and how can the other be maybe made better?
Well, let me start with the second. I went to, one of the first things I did in this was that I went to a huge event that was Franklin Graham, Samaritan's Purse. I don't know how many of you know Samaritan's Purse, one of the big sort of evangelical groups that have been working in many parts of the world. And it was a remarkable event. There were several thousand people in the Hilton. It had been hugely financed, which was an eye-opener to me because I wasn't used to it. All the Africans who came to this were given full clothing outfits because it was cold. I mean, they had, sweatshirts and they were nothing missing in the organization. And the event itself was both terrifying because there was some very strong anti-Muslim language, which I found very disturbing. There was some very absolute language. I remember distinctly one person who said, any discussion of sex in schools promotes lust. So, anything that has to do with education or information about AIDS is dangerous and should be stopped. So, there were some things that made me personally, shall we say, very uneasy. But they also had video clips from all over the world of these absolutely remarkable people. People who were dedicated, giving up. I worked on DRC for many years, Congo. And, the stories that come out of the Congo, who's left? It's the religious organizations that are left, that are trying to run schools and to help people. So you have this contrast between the dangers of absolutism, which is not everybody, but which is there, and these stories of heroism. So, clearly what we'd like to do is accentuate the positive and minimize the negative, right? And the way to do that, I think, is to celebrate the positive. So put more attention on it, put more information out so that people know what's happening, and know it in a way that they can understand it. In other words, one of the problems with the world of religion, among others, is that almost everything that's put out is put out either for fundraising purposes or for something else, so that is, shall we say, not very objective. Actually, I was just looking at Wathnow's introduction as I was coming up, and he was saying, everything's great if you read about American churches overseas. Everything works. The experiences are all transformational. Everything works. And that is, I think, a piece of the story. So it's very difficult to be objective. But still, I think credible stories, credible evidence is a very important part of the process. Yes, I'm optimistic. Part of it is chronic. In other words, I have an optimistic bias sort of built in. But also there are a lot of great and exciting things happening, and I think that it is going in a positive direction. But it's much harder than it should be, and I'm constantly amazed. I started with a brief discussion of some of the sort of hesitations that people have with dealing with religion. I think that the most complicated, the most sensitive issues, the biggest cultural change of our time is gender. I happen to think that it's the biggest single change in the way people live and behave from the time they wake up in the morning till the time they go to sleep. we're living a revolution. But in religion, it is also the pluralism of our societies, the openness, the transition, and it's a wild marketplace. So I think it isn't something, and trying, and this comes back to Paul's point, trying to corral it into something that's simple, some recipe, 10 points, I think is a mistake. Of course, I think that's true for a lot of things. I think trying to simplify things too much is very dangerous. But it is a part of some of the glory of the sort of globalized world, of the opening up and awareness, the curiosity. And if you think about it, people in the past, they were born somewhere, they were told what they did, they were afraid, religion was just sort of a part of life, not something that was a matter of choice or a matter of deep reflection often. And today we have a completely different world and a completely different opportunity. Yes?
When you were talking about the debate over vertical versus horizontal approaches, can you elaborate? Were you talking specifically about approaches to dealing with healthcare, or do you mean sort of more broadly ways of looking at development with like an integrated, trying to harmonize development approaches and trying to keep people from dealing with too many external actors, or sort of like the social entrepreneur, everyone sort of specializes in their area?
I actually talked about both, I think, separately, but let me sort of try to link them a little bit. The healthcare debates are very much about how much resources, how much attention should go into these disease-specific campaigns versus the long, hard, complicated, difficult job of building national health systems and dealing with all of the issues around them, including the one that affects religion to an extent, the respective roles of public and private education. And we're seeing the same sorts of things in education. But I think health is rather unique because you do have, you have the tradition of smallpox and polio eradication and guinea worm and now malaria and AIDS and TB and a few other diseases where you really can't, malaria is interesting because there really is a case for focusing on malaria, because if you don't eradicate malaria in certain areas, you'll never get rid of it. And the same was true of river blindness and a few other diseases. The danger is that it is very attractive for engineers or people who are military who like to run campaigns because, it makes everything dividable into things. It can be a chain of command. You can evaluate it. You can monitor it and so forth. Whereas, in fact, it's complicated. One of the sad things we're looking, and among other issues that we're looking at right now, is maternal mortality. And one reason why maternal mortality has not gone down is that it doesn't have these kinds of magic bullets. Maternal mortality is basically about two things. It's about basic facilities, and it is about attitudes. And those two have to come together. So clearly there's a need to focus more. I can't remember. I need this because I'm giving a talk on Wednesday on sort of health ethics, but I can't remember whether it's 35% of global health spending is going to AIDS, some huge percentage, and it's disproportionate. We all know. Now, obviously, there should be more funding going, not less funding going into AIDS, but it is an issue. The issue of aid coordination is fascinating, and it affects religions in very interesting ways. Clearly the global consensus is it's out of control, completely out of control. There are so many organizations that are working often at cross purposes, don't know what anyone does. No poor minister of finance can have any idea what's going on. There's the Basque Development Program, there's the Latvian Development Program, etc. So it has gone from a situation which was already complicated in my day, 20, 30 years ago, when we were saying, we really don't know all the projects that are going on, even in Gambia, which is a tiny country, to a situation which is unbelievably complicated and impossible to steer. So that's why you have the aid harmonization, Paris Declaration, Rome Declaration, Accra Declaration, et cetera, which are trying to harmonize processes and which are basically trying to get the herd moving in a sensible direction. There is another view. The other view is that competition is good, creativity comes from the bottom, and there is an implicit, sometimes explicit piece to that, which is that governments are corrupt and interfere and mess things up. And you have more now, and so I've been in a couple of meetings where people have done straw polls. Let me see, I have a straw poll here. How many are in the Get a Grip camp, and how many are in the Let 1,000 Flowers Bloom competition? Okay, Get a Grip. Okay. 1,000 flowers?
Is there and it's complicated?
It's complicated. Okay. Well, you have a higher proportion of the competition here. Usually it's about 80-20 in sort of development professionals. In other words, people are uneasy with trying to have everything come under one basket, but there is also an awareness that the only way you're going to get Ghana moving is if the Ghanaian people and the Ghanaian government have some role in steering things in a certain direction. But the groups that are most resistant to this are the ones who've never really been part of this, who are not often part of the funding. It's the religious groups. And they are particularly resistant to being part of this, unless, of course, there are large amounts of money that are not very heavily tied.
And I think it's beyond just that issue. I think American religious groups in particular, and especially evangelical groups, have this organizational tendency to try to avoid bureaucracy and to emphasize these sort of relational approaches to social problems. So when you layer that onto this greater approach to development, 1,000 flowers blooming, I think you're really going to see religious organizations going in that direction. Maybe that's another source of conflict with bigger development.
And then you have the corruption issue in there somewhere.
Maybe time for one last question.
Yeah, this is sort of a sociology question. Because I'm not a sociologist, I'm not sure it's a sociological question, but it gets back to what you were talking about, the kind of lack of awareness or dialogue of the reality of religion and experience that might draw from it. And I guess it's an optimism question, because I'm struck often when I talk to religious NGO leaders and professionals how they don't want to talk about religion, and that they're socialized in the same discourse that the professionals in the World Bank and the State Department are. They went to the same schools, they all went to the same business school. Maybe this is just in Washington, not in the field. But I guess maybe is your experience, because you're much more experienced in this, is this just a rare set of people that I'm talking to? Or can you speak to the professionalization of the development work done by religious groups and what that harbors for kind of work with the kind of National State Department or World Bank, and what that might mean for the future of NGOs?
Well, I've come to call the organizations faith-inspired, and I have two reasons that led me to change my vocabulary. The first was that there are a number of important organizations, particularly in the Muslim world, but the most significant is the Aga Khan network, that don't want to be labeled or identified as faith-based. And in the Islamic world, it's because a lot of groups are afraid of being considered Islamist. So even though they may be quite closely tied to the mosques or to an organization, they would not label themselves that way. But I also think that so that I think was part of it. The other is just the increasing awareness of the incredible span of the organizations that go all the way from, Habitat to an organization like Compassion, which is much, much more church to church and which is much more explicit about its religious mission. And it takes a lot of probing, I think, to understand where religion comes into it. And that's what we're doing with our interviews. And we get very interesting and very different answers. I was surprised last week, I guess, there was a conference at Georgetown on the common word, and one of the speakers was Ken Hackett, who is the head of CRS. And there was a panel on NGOs, and he said something that I've never heard him say before, and I'm still puzzling. I want to talk to him about it. But he said, some people think that faith-based NGOs are really just the same as other NGOs, and, if you build a well, it's not going to be different because it has a religious origin or there's a religious, but he said, no, he said, we are fundamentally different. We are different, completely different. And he wasn't terribly clear on what he meant. I think what he means is that he is suggesting that the motivation is different, that the way the organization frames its mission is different. Now, I've been involved with CARE for some time, and I don't think the people in CARE would accept that, nor would the people in the World Bank. So it's a different way of framing your motivations, and I don't think that I don't think you can label. I don't think that, it's not even a range of color, going from white to black with, every color of the rainbow in between. It's much more a mix and an amalgam. And what's interesting and important is much more the way that people's motivation translates into organizational culture. I think it's that organizational culture that is what I'm coming to look at more carefully.
And you notice a difference? I mean, I'm just like World Vision, friends of mine who work at World Vision, went to Harvard Business School, go to cocktail parties with all the DC development people. They don't know much about theology at all.
Well, World Vision has, 40,000 plus people? I mean, it's unbelievable. But they're very different. And that's one of the characteristics of World Vision is that they have a very different character in different parts of the world. We have a couple of really interesting interviews with World Vision people on our website that I think are, they're quite telling. And they also see the organization going through a fundamental transition, including how they work with Muslim in societies where the majority of their employees are Muslim. And different organizations have different rules. There's some, for example, where they acknowledge Hope International, Hope Worldwide is one, where they acknowledge that there would never be somebody who's not part of their church in the senior management. So there's this sort of glass ceiling that, but that's where this organizational culture comes into it. And I do not believe that the world is divided into faith and non-faith. I think that it is a part of history and society, sociology, that there is a tremendous concern in religious communities for poverty and for the welfare of people in the world. It isn't exclusive, but it is very significant. It has deep historical roots. It has huge reach. They are major players in the world of development. And the fact that the development profession has been like the minister with the donkeys, they just didn't see it, I think is a major part of the story.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Catherine.